Welcome back, everyone, to the Longevity Lab. I'm your host, Juliet.
And I'm Mackie.
And today we have a very exciting in-person guest. Welcome, Nate Klemp, to the show. Nate is a New York Times bestselling co-author of Start Here, a philosopher, founding partner at Mindful Magazine, and co-author of The 80-80 Marriage, and his newest book, Open, Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. He received his MA at Stanford, followed by a PhD at Princeton in political philosophy. Aside from reading his books, you'll also find Nate on Instagram, where he is exploring short videos on meditating in the wild, and on YouTube, where he's offering mindfulness instruction. When he's not doing all of that, you can find him hiking in the hills of Boulder, meditating in odd places, and playing a little jazz on the piano. Welcome, Nate.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here in person.
Yeah.
In Boulder.
Boulderized.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a rare treat.
Yeah,
I appreciate being here.
I'm sure we've passed each other on a hike or something.
Probably, yeah. It's Sanitas or whatever.
Right. You mentioned Sanitas in the book, and I was like, oh yeah, this is so relatable.
Totally.
I know, I really
there's a lot of Boulder in this book,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah. I could picture myself at the Costco.
Yes, Costco in Superior. You've probably been there.
We were
I was
just
like,
there.
you're
Nice.
describing where things were in that Costco. I'm like, we were just there 2 weeks ago. I know
Nice.
exactly
That's
what he's talking about.
amazing.
I don't know, and we'll get into it. If I have the courage to do a meditation sitting in a Costco, but maybe one day.
Yeah. Well, it is the advanced practice, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So I loved your book, and I also loved being able to read this book so quickly before you came on the show. I know the book just came out in February, and so here you are, and I just finished it 2 days ago. So it's so fresh in my mind, and I've been thinking a lot about it. Especially, we just went to Moab this past weekend, and we ended up in a situation where it was like glamping, and the weather was not exactly what we had hoped for, and
It was windy.
the tent was like flapping and vibrating, and it was nuts, right? And so I was trying to just open to accepting like what was going on and utilizing some of your techniques. I was like counting my breaths and just being like, how can we be here with this? What's happening right now? Because it's so uncomfortable. And we slept for 2 hours, and I'll open with that 2 hours of sleep allowed us to do something the next day that we wouldn't have done otherwise, because it changed our whole plans for the day. But we ended up having a really special day that we wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. And so from something shitty, when we just accepted and opened, came something really cool. So
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about your book a lot when that was happening. Like, okay, just be open to life and what's happening, instead of we tend to fight and close off to things a lot.
Right.
So I would love to hear from you, what inspired this book, and what does it mean to open versus being closed?
Well, I think that example of Moab is a great starting point, because I think we all have moments like that. And collectively as a society, I think we're having a moment like that where it's like, wouldn't it be great to just be able to control the weather for our amazing vacation in Moab? Wouldn't it be great to control the flow of geopolitical events, or whether or not we're in the middle of a pandemic, all of these things? And it's this really seductive trap of the mind, I think, this tendency to want to control and want to feel good all the time. In the book, I have a name for that. I call this Happy Land. And Happy Land, in a way, is just like the modern illusion that we get on social media, that we get even through like a lot of the, influencer bro biohacking podcasts. There's this illusion that like, if you just take the right supplements and you do the right workouts and, you do all the right life hacks, you can control everything and feel amazing all of the time. And for anybody who's tried that, which I know we all have in this room, that like at a certain point, it just doesn't work. And so there's this alternative quality of the mind that I think is really worth exploring, which is, it's fine if we can exert some control over our lives, and we should do that when we can. But the other quality is something more like, and the word I use is open. Another word you could use is allowing, acceptance, but just the ability to be in a situation where we're experiencing discomfort, and rather than doing our habitual action, which might be pulling out our phone or seeking out political outrage or any of these other strategies we have, to just like be with things as they are, which is crazy and scary and uncomfortable, but there's a whole lot of possibility that comes out of that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, something a therapist of mine said to me years ago, and she was so spot on. She's like, "You're always just trying to be 2 steps ahead of your pain."
Mm.
Just kind of future focused, so forward on like, how can I think of every which way the scenario might go and play out so that I can then have a way of controlling all of those scenarios and like, okay, so if this were to occur, then I would do X, Y, and Z steps to make that better for me or so I can feel better rather than just being with whatever that thing is and have no idea really how the outcome is going to turn out or what was going to occur. But it makes me think about that, how we try to
Yeah,
like kind of micromanage every little aspect of things.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are engaged in micromanagement. And at a cultural level, I think there are a couple of interesting things happening that are different and unprecedented. One is we have this amazing way of mitigating discomfort that we didn't have 20 years ago,
Hmm.
which is a phone. So anytime I now feel slight anxiety or I feel irritation, I can just whip out my phone and experience these quick hits of dopamine. So that's one of the drivers of this momentum of closure that I think is new and different that we're experiencing as a culture. But then the other is we are now way more polarized politically than we've ever been before.
Yeah.
So that's, I think of the smartphone addiction piece being internal closure, closing off to our own minds, the political polarization piece being a more external form of closure where it's like anybody who now disagrees with me, they're not just someone who has a different perspective. They are the enemy. They're totally misguided. They're irrational. They're morons.
Hmm.
And so in the midst of all of this closure, I think it's a really profound practice to think about, okay, how do we cultivate a little bit more openness in our mind? And by doing that, I think we actually create more openness in the world.
Yeah. We've been passionately talking about the phone for several
Mm.
podcasts. I'm sorry, listeners, if you're just like, God, the phone
Yeah, the
again.
phone.
But this relationship with the phone, it's so fucked. I
Yeah.
like on a regular basis just feel like I'm so addicted and you not as much. I'm so in awe of how less addicted you are than me. Like to study our brain waves to see like what's occurring there.
I just think I'm slightly older than you, so I had more time to develop
Interesting.
without being on the phone. It was more of a
Interesting.
newer thing. I don't know, maybe.
Perhaps.
Although, my parents are pretty addicted to the phone too, so that doesn't really a
Right.
theory doesn't
Oh
hold water, I
yeah,
guess.
definitely. I was just thinking that the iPad, maybe not the phone, but just being on the screen, right?
Yeah.
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 Um, but I think about this on a regular basis with it. It's like it pulls you to it and
Mhm.
it just wants you to touch it and look at it and go, Instagram, Instagram, Facebook, email, like on repeat.
Mhm.
For me, at
Yeah,
least those are the apps that I'm like, and it's
sure.
just there's nothing there. And
It's
I think, you mentioned doing, an experiment in the book where you fully allowed yourself to just go into the screen addiction fully, like without any limitations. Can you describe this as a practice that is used is it in Buddhism as well in a different
yeah,
way?
tantric. Yeah, so I thought it'd be really interesting before looking at opening to really understand, well, what does it feel like? What does it mean to close intentionally? And so instead of, most of us, when we approach our screens now, especially people who are listening to this podcast, it's from a place of restraint. I'm going to stop myself from having so much screen time. You can even use these devices like the K-Safe where you can lock your phone up for 2 hours and you can't get to it. And all those tactics are great. But there's this other tactic that comes out of Tantric Buddhism where they had a practice called feast practice. And the basic idea, they were using this with like things like eating or alcohol or sex. And the idea behind the practice was that you could intentionally indulge in these things that cause craving. And by doing so, you could eradicate the roots of these desires. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do that with my screen?
Mhm.
So I spent like 3 days, all day, every day, just like binging on this buffet of mind snacks. Like for me, it's news and email and a little bit of Instagram and Netflix and things like that. So I spent 3 days doing that, and I learned a couple really interesting things. One is the connection between sleep and screens is real. I can now report that every day I did this, I would be up the next day at like 2:50 in the morning.
Wow.
With no hope of going back to sleep. So just destroyed my sleep. But I think the more important thing I learned is that the thing that was drawing me to my screen was this experience of novelty. Like if you think about when you pick up your phone, what is it that's drawing you in? It's the fact that there's going to be some new text, some new email, a new feed on Facebook. And who knows, maybe today, unlike every other day, it's going to be Oprah, and she's inviting you onto her show or whatever it is, right? We live with that delusion. And so by going all the way with my phone for 3 days, all day, every day, I basically was able to destroy its superpower.
That's
because
amazing.
at a certain point, like I had seen everything there was to see.
You
Like there was
reached the end of the
there was
internet.
nothing new. Yeah. I mean, I didn't actually reach the end of the internet, but it felt like I did.
Right.
And so what I learned is that we can shift our habits around screens in one of two ways. We can do the restraint-based approach, dopamine fasting, that kind of thing. And there are a lot of great tactics there. But we can also play with the indulgence side of the polarity.
We experience something similar with carbs. So we do a lot of ultra running and getting out on like for 8 hours on the trails. And when you're doing something like that, you need to get like 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the third hour in, it's like, man, I got to eat more carbs. And by the end of the day, you are so sick of sugar, you're so sick of sweets, you're so sick of like any kind of carbohydrate that it's like, I'm just going to eat meat for the next, 3 days, So it's an interesting, that feast really does work.
Yeah, it can. There's a woman, an author, Janine Roth, who wrote this incredible book for anyone struggling with binge eating disorder called Women, Food, and God. And I struggled with that when I was much younger. And in her book, she really was a big proponent of this feasting, just letting yourself have it all rather than having the mindset of I'm not allowed and I'm restricting. And so I'm going to try to stay away. So how she healed herself from binging was eating anything and everything. Now, obviously, some things work for some people and some things don't work for others. But this seems to be applicable in different scenarios for people.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's an insight there, which is that the more we restrict, whether it's around eating or our screens, and we say to ourselves, you can't do that, and we exit out, the more desirable it becomes. I mean, that's just like the way the mind works. It's like, oh, well, now I really want it. And now the craving is intensified. So I love that idea. And I've played with that a little bit around diet, the whole concept of a cheat day once a week. I find cheat day is not only helpful because now I get to eat whatever I want, and that's kind of fun, but also because I get to the end of cheat day and I'm like, I feel awful. Like, I don't want to eat this crap anymore. I want to actually eat better food.
Yeah.
And you don't get that experience if all you're doing is restricting yourself.
Yeah. And then you're ultimately having that cookie or brownie that you're like, oh man, and you're doing that all the time.
And then there's the judgment and I'm a bad person and the shame and
Yeah. Also, did you find that you kind of tuned into the absurdity of things when you were doing this screen binge, just the absurdity of the news and the different narratives and like the theater aspect of a lot of these kinds of influencers? And how did you kind of like, did it lose its allure in a way because you were just kind of seeing it differently?
Yeah, I mean, there were all these funny moments. I was watching like Fox and CNN for large stretches of the day, and I was amazed by just like the ads on daytime television news, like the latest A1C formula and like this supplement for frequent urination and migraine attacks. And, there was an ad for the Museum of the Bible where they have like a Bible that Elvis owned. And so there was like that dimension of it. But then also just, seeing, I think beneath the absurdity, how much anger and outrage is out there, especially when it comes to anything that touches politics. Like, there was just this big learning for me that I realized everywhere I went where there was a conversation happening about politics, whether it's like the op-ed page for the New York Times or CNN or Fox, everybody was just mad and pissed
Yeah.
off and mad at each other. And there was a villain and a victim, and it depended, depending on what network you watched, it was the opposite side that was the villain or the victim. But yeah, it was kind of totally absurd at a certain point, which also led me to want to turn it off.
Do you find that watching both CNN and Fox kind of neutralizes it? You kind of see both sides of the story, and then you're like, well, okay, this is not holding that same kind of power anymore.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things I recommend for the whole problem of political polarization. Like, how do we become less polarized ourselves? One of the easiest things we can do is just look at, like, where are we getting our news and information? And is it only coming from one silo? And if it
Right.
is, like, it's pretty profound to just start paying attention to the other side's media outlets. And you might not agree with them. It might make you a little bit upset, but that's probably okay because it's challenging some of those basic assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I was thinking about this on our last podcast, just the idea that we're all looking to be right all the time. So we're
Yeah.
looking for what we want. We're
Yep.
looking for that truth that fits our narrative, that makes our world, whatever our, world we want to have happen,
Yep.
exist more, versus being open to maybe that's not actually the truth. It might be what you want the truth to be, but it could be more
Right.
nuanced than that. And that's really
Yeah.
tough to open yourself up to that idea that, like, perhaps what you want to be what's, quote unquote real has some complexity to it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, and you're pointing there to one of the key characteristics of open versus closed as it relates to our mind. When we are closed, there's this small, compressed perspective in the mind. And you were articulating that as like, all you're seeing is this one perspective, or all you're hearing is this one set of information or news. And I think that's a microcosm for the larger experience of open versus closed, that when we're closed, that's the key experience, is that the mind just becomes smaller, right? Like, we are just seeing less of what's happening. We're less available to what's happening in the present moment. We're less curious about what might be happening outside of our little political echo chamber. Everything just gets smaller. And I think that the big argument for cultivating a more open mind is that when we open the mind, it's like there's more space in the mind itself. And I know that sounds weird. Like, why would you want more space in your mind? But if you think about it, that space is the space that allows us to respond instead of react in a triggered way. That's the space between stimulus and response that allows us to build new and better habits. It's the space of possibility, the space of creativity. And ultimately, I think it's the space of freedom that allows us to direct our time and attention toward the things that matter most to us, rather than what matters most to Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, or whatever our favorite algorithm might be.
Yeah. We think about this idea of being closed and being narrow-minded in a sense. And I think of when we say to people, "Oh, they're just so stuck in their ways," right? And it's because all of us are being programmed all the time by these different media outlets. And if we don't allow more opening, then we're really just kind of parroting everything that we see. We don't really have choice. There's this whole, like, do we actually have free will? Or
Right.
are we just being kind of like a robot, like led around by what the narratives are out there and what is best for the economy or, the powers to be? I know a lot of people like to
Yeah.
think there's some nefarious, like, top that's, doing all this stuff to us. But I just think that human beings are very powerful. We're powerful in that we can be really controlled in a sense. Like, we're powerful that we have a lot of opening and we have a lot of choice and agency. If we kind of just start to begin to see things like this, like, oh, wait, perhaps these habits are closing me and I would have more capacity to open to things that I never thought were even imaginable in my life, for more freedom and pleasure even. I know, not like happy land pleasure, but just like,
Yeah.
when we moved here, we both talked about like feeling these moments of like ecstasy that we never experienced before, because we had lived in cities, and coming out to the expansiveness of like the Rocky Mountains and like sitting, in the middle of a alpine lake and a bighorn sheep comes up to you. You're like, wow, like a
Totally.
moment of ecstasy, and like that kind of, like you're saying, the mind opens in a way that I had never really experienced before. I know nature can do that for a lot of people, but I hear what you're saying in that people get very stuck, and it's one of the common complaints that a lot of my clients have is they always feel very stuck. They're like on autopilot. They can't seem to get out of their own way with these certain habits and thoughts and feelings, and they don't have the observing mind to be like, "Hey, wait a minute. I have a moment to like decide, am I gonna eat that cookie or maybe not? Am I gonna, lay on the couch, or
Totally.
maybe I go for a walk?" Like the things that they want to do to make themselves feel better.
Yeah. Well, and one way to think about the difference here is we all have a system of habits. We have a system of habits in our own personal life, in our relationships. So, my wife and I, we write about relationships. I do some relationship coaching. See this one all the time, that relationships have these systems of habits. And the key move is to shift from all of those habits being accidental. What I mean by accidental is like, never really thought about it, never really placed much intention on it. I think of it as like the wing it approach. And that happens in relationships where we say, hey, we're just going to let like random historical accident determine who does the finances or who cooks the food or who takes out the garbage. But also in our own personal lives, the wing it approach might look like, well, I'm just going to see what happens when I go to my local Safeway and eat anything that I desire. I'm going to eat like Fruit Loops and this and that or whatever. That accidental approach, as we all know, doesn't really work all that well, and it doesn't give us much freedom, to your point. So in some ways, I think the big game is, how do we become a little bit more intentional about this underlying unconscious system of habits and start to tweak these habits so that we do have a little more space, a little more freedom. And maybe we do eat Fruit Loops one day, but maybe the next day we're like, no, I don't need to eat Fruit Loops, right? Like, so it's not like we need to avoid vice. And I think that's true of Screenland as well. That's what I call Instagram. But I don't think it's bad in a categorical sense. I just think that we're probably getting lost there. And so when we have more freedom, we can go on Instagram. We can go, indulge these short-term pleasures and quick hits of dopamine. We're not like trapped there. And I think that's the key distinction.
Yeah, I saw you apologizing to Instagram recently.
Yes, I was trying to, it was kind of a joke, but I was
Love
like,
it.
I wrote an apology letter to TikTok and Instagram because I had spent so much time calling them a dystopian hellscape.
I spend a lot of time calling them
Yeah.
that.
And people didn't like that post, by the way. They were like, why are you doing this? Why do you keep saying it's a dystopian hellscape?
That's the shadow side of it, because it can
Yeah.
feel like a dystopian hellscape, and it also depends on like the mood you're in. For me, if I feel like I'm not getting something from it and I'm putting a lot of energy into it, then I will call it this dystopian hellscape, like this abusive relationship. Actually, Mark Groves, are you familiar with him? He has like
No.
where I think it's called Where's the Love podcast. He's a relationship expert from
Oh,
Canada.
interesting. Okay.
And he just said that he's quitting. Like he's deleting all his accounts. He has over 1 million followers. He's worked on this account
Wow.
for over 10 years. And he's like, I am deleting my accounts, everybody. You can find me on my podcasts, my
Yeah.
books, and I'm going to try to create a community, but I'm not going to be on these platforms anymore, because he felt, to him, he likened it to an abusive relationship and how he was with these platforms and what it
Yeah.
did with him, always kind of like chasing the next algorithm. And,
Yep.
and I get that, because not that I'm, dancing on TikTok and trying to get like that quick, what is it when you have like a viral, like I'm not trying to
Yeah,
go
the viral
viral and
moment.
anything like that. But if you are, that really is, you're just chasing this kind of like,
Yeah, and
it's
you
a cat
worked
chasing
so
its tail.
hard on this post and
Yeah.
you put it up and there's like no likes and one comment that
Yeah.
says you look stupid, like
Yeah.
what an idiotic thing to say or whatever. And
Yeah.
it's really heartbreaking. It's not
Yeah.
a good way to live.
And these platforms like Meta, they're trying to make money and they're trying to show what they want to show. And it's not like exactly what you want, right? If you have
Yeah.
X amount of followers and, only 1% are actually seeing what you're showing, it's a tough
Yeah.
pill to swallow. So I get why, one might call it a dystopian hellscape because I
Totally.
definitely have felt like that. But at the same time, you mentioned like it's also done a lot of amazing things.
For
My
sure.
client base is from these platforms.
Yeah.
The people I work with all over come from social media. I would not have
Yeah.
met all these incredible people. We wouldn't have had the ability to without it. So it's like there's that
There's
other
that too.
side, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think as a general rule, anytime we're totally Xing something out and saying like, oh, that's terrible, like that's probably an opportunity to open up a little bit. So even though, social media and all these technologies might be the cause of some of the closure, I don't want to argue for a perspective where it's now like, and they're evil and we should never go on these platforms, because I don't think that's true. Like, to your point, there's power to these. And that's in some ways the nuance of this whole project of opening is that there's a lot of complexity there. There's not a lot of clear categorical, this is good, this is bad
Yeah.
kind of statements.
There was a study that you talk about in your book that we were legitimately reading the same study in different books at the same time in bed.
Oh.
And
I
we were
was
like,
reading The Comfort Crisis, Michael Easter.
Oh, was this the one with the shock?
yeah,
Yes,
Yeah, you want me to
I
describe
would love
that
our
for people who
listeners
don't
to
have the
hear this study
context?
but it was so
because
funny
yeah,
because we were both sitting in bed, and I'm
Yeah.
like, I got to tell you about this study, and she's reading your book, and she was like, I
No
got to tell you about
way.
this study. It was the same one.
That's funny because I haven't read that book yet. It's on my list.
It's good. It's
Yeah.
great.
So here's the study. Timothy Wilson, he's a professor at the University of Virginia. He conducted this study. I think it was 2017. And what they did first is they had people go into a room. They had to put away their phone, their backpack, everything. And they experienced what they called a 15-minute thinking period, where they just kind of sat there, with nothing to do. And you might think like busy people would be like, oh my God, that was amazing. 15 minutes. But the majority of people rated it as extremely unpleasant. So the upshot of that is like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. We seem to have this built-in aversion to idle time in our own mind. But then they upped the stakes a bit. And this is probably the part you all were talking about. They did the same experiment where they had people go into this room for 15 minutes. They didn't have a phone. They didn't have anything else they could use to distract themselves. But this time they had a choice. They could either sit there with their thoughts, or they could administer a high voltage shock to themselves because they had an electrode attached to their ankle and a button that they could push. So the question became like, okay, well, what do people do? Well, 27% of women shocked themselves. 67% of men shocked themselves. One dude shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. And the conclusion of the study is that they were just blown away by the fact that most people would rather torture themselves than simply be present and in the moment with their own mind. And that study, I think, goes a long way to explaining why it is that we're so addicted to screens and why it is that it's so difficult to be in the present moment. Because everybody, I think, would say in theory, like, oh, I'd like to be more present with my partner. I'd like to be more present with my kids. I'd like to be more present, just like walking down the street and noticing it's springtime. And yet we have this like built-in aversion to that experience. It's uncomfortable. Whereas going to something like Screenland, super comfortable, lined with dopamine hits. So that was just a really powerful study in just setting the predicament up.
How's it been for you in your experience with that? Just, you are an experienced meditator.
Mm-hmm.
So where you are spending quite a bit of time with no distractions and no screen, just you and your thoughts. So I'm curious, how is it for you in your relationship with your own mind and your thoughts? And if you could share any insights with listeners that they might get some takeaways around why is this so difficult for us to just be with ourselves?
Yeah. Well, so one way to think about meditation is to think this is a way to feel relaxed, to clear the mind of thoughts. And that's a really popular view. I personally don't subscribe to that as the way I think about meditation. I mean, everybody can have their own view, lots different, there's room for different methodologies. In my experience, the real power of meditation is that you are setting aside time to basically run that Timothy Wilson experiment again and again every single day. And so, yeah, there are moments where it's blissful and it's pleasurable and you hear the birds and you're like, wow, this is amazing, like raw, direct confrontation with the present moment. But there are just as many, if not more, moments where it's like swirling thoughts and anxiety and, jealousy toward other people who are doing better or whatever. And that, I think, is actually like the beautiful thing about meditation is just training your tolerance for that sort of discomfort. Because I think if you want to have a bit more presence in your life, if you want to establish more mindfulness, probably the key skill we need to train first is that ability to be with discomfort without recoiling, because it's the draw toward comfort that's keeping us locked into our screens and things like that. And sitting between us and a more present experience in our life, sitting between us and a more connected relationship often is some form of discomfort. So to me, meditation is really about just like learning how to stay with whatever arises. If it's bliss, cool, let's stay with that. If it's anxiety, cool, let's stay with that. And that's a very countercultural, counter-habitual thing to do.
Well, I think it goes back to what you're sharing, that we're all trying to kind of get somewhere and get to happy land and feel better,
Yeah.
right? So meditation is often posed as this opportunity to do that.
Right,
If
like
I
you're going to get rid of anxiety by meditating.
Exactly. And we're going to do this visualization meditation and I'm going to feel blissed out
Yes.
afterwards and my nervous system is going to be so calm and this is medicine for me, right? Versus what you're sharing is it can be really painful and uncomfortable and your mind is just going to do what it's going to do and you're just going to just be with it. And for me, I've found that knowing that expectation that meditation isn't about getting anywhere or clearing your thoughts. When I found that out, that was so freeing. I'm like, oh, thank God, because I fucking can't.
Yeah.
I can't. Anytime I meditate, it's just like, oh, last week this happened, or oh, what am I gonna have for dinner? Or, oh, I suck at this. I'm so bad. I can't meditate. I'll never be this. I'll never amount to anything. Like, and then it just goes down the dark hole of like, I
Right.
suck like at everything in my life,
Yeah.
to, okay, keep going, keep at it. All right, watch the thoughts like clouds. You just watch this like
Totally.
cacophony like happen.
Yeah, and it's weird because like the mind is going crazy like that with this whole swirl. And when we're meditating, we don't just want to let the mind totally go. Most forms of meditation, there's a meta awareness we're trying to cultivate where it's like, can I see that that's happening? Can I label it as something like thoughts? Can I then come back to my breath? Or maybe it's a more open awareness style of meditation, which I talk about in the book, where you're just kind of opening awareness to include everything that's happening. But in either case, yeah, there's this kind of like alternation between getting lost in thoughts and then that moment where you snap out of it. There's a little bit of meta awareness and then you get lost in thoughts, snap out of it. And to me, that's the essence of the practice. The other thing though is once you drop the idea that it's about feeling bliss, that opens up what we were talking about before we started taping, this whole realm of what I call street meditation or street opening, where we bring meditation into just the chaotic world, because like on one view of meditation, well, we need to escape from our life. We need to put on the earphones and, seal ourselves away from distraction. We need to go to the ashram in the mountains. And that's cool. I'm not putting that down at all. Sometimes we need that. But I think it's really interesting to go to your local Costco. We were talking about that because that's one of the chapters in the book. But also, I have this buddy here in town. We'll just do this once a month or so. We went to Flatirons Crossing. Have you guys ever been there in
The
Superior?
mall.
It's
Yeah.
just like mall. Like it is like
old school mall.
it is old school.
We
mall.
love an old school mall.
Yeah,
'cause
like
we grew up
you
in
know,
that era.
J. Crew,
You know?
Victoria's Secret, Gap.
Yeah.
And so our most recent experiment was we went there and we just meditated. We met in the food court, you know, and then we did kind of like aimless wandering, walking meditation, meditated outside of these various chain stores, inside of the chain stores. And it was like the most profound spiritual experience I think I've ever had. I think in part because there was so much resistance for me and so much judgment and like, why are people buying this crap? And like,
Yeah.
you know, my mind's going crazy about like, this is capitalism and it's
with the
worst. And
world.
like, this is what's wrong with the world.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's where if you let go of the idea that meditation should be this blissful, pleasurable thing, all of a sudden it gets like 10 times more interesting because now we're like interested in the shadow side of life and the darker places of the mind. And can we be with those too?
Yeah.
And that's where I think there's a little bit more liberation because now we don't have to run away all the time when things get crazy or edgy.
Mm-hmm.
We can stay.
This is, you know, useful for all types of discomfort. You know, I've been kind of doing that with my relationship with pain.
Yeah.
You know, not that
pain's a big one.
not that we want to like, you know, in the book, you describe doing this meditation during a dental procedure.
Yeah.
Where you opt out of
the
getting
sedation. Yeah.
Can you imagine, Mackie? Well, he's
No.
never had a cavity, so he doesn't even know what
Yeah.
what Novocaine is
Yeah.
or
Yeah, it's funny. My wife and daughter and I were just on vacation talking about that, and they're like, "You can never do that again." Like it was actually really traumatizing for me, but also for them.
Yeah.
Picking me up in the middle of this madness that I had created for myself.
Yeah, so you have to have like a line that you
Yeah.
kind of don't cross maybe with, you know,
Totally.
opening up to discomfort and realizing like there are some things that we have access to now that we should take advantage of, like being sedated and numbed out
Exactly.
when we're getting a dental procedure.
Well, yeah, I call that skillful closing. It's not always the best route to open. Sometimes it's good to close.
Yeah.
But one other example of this that I think some people might resonate with is I've had ringing in my ear for like 15 years, tinnitus. And I tried to get rid of it using every possible way, you know, like every supplement, searching the internet for all these like crazy, you know, like sound technologies and this and that. And every time I would do that, it wouldn't work. I would feel even more discouraged. The ringing would feel even more painful and it would create even more suffering. And this is actually one of the reasons I wrote the book. I had this crazy experience where at a certain point I realized like, what if I just allow this thing to be? And I just incorporate this ringing in my ear into my reality. And it wasn't instant, but it completely changed my experience of it. And I habituated to it. And I came to find later on that like when it comes to things like tinnitus and chronic pain, often the only scientifically validated cure, quote unquote, is acceptance, is opening.
Mm-hmm.
You just triggered my tinnitus to start. But usually I don't
you have
notice
tinnitus?
it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, me too. Yeah, no, I have it a little bit. I mean, if I pay attention right now, I can hear it in my left ear.
Right.
Yeah.
I can hear it, but then I forget about it basically. Right.
Yeah.
And it just kind of goes away.
Yeah. Well, and there's actually this really amazing guy named Bruce Hubbard, I believe is his name. And he's a psychologist at Columbia University who had really bad tinnitus. And this is like his thing. And what he says is like, the key is just to remind yourself that over time, almost everyone, like 92% of people with tinnitus will habituate. And so when you get freaked out about it and you're like, oh, no, it's never going to go away and it's only going to get worse. Just to remind yourself, like, I will habituate to this. Like, I will learn to accept this. And that keeps you from going down like the spiral of the mind.
I've done this with other things too. Like I've had this knee thing that's been bothering me. And it's bad enough where I notice it, but it's not bad enough where I need to actually do anything. Really, if I were to go to physical therapy, they would say I just need to rest it and maybe do a couple strengthening exercises. So, but I'll notice it on certain runs and certain different hikes. And if I just allow it to, if I try to push it away and I'm really focused on it, then it persists and might even get worse. But if I try to just be with it and just let it be, it'll decrease significantly, if not go away, and I almost forget about it.
Yeah.
There's
Isn't that wild?
this physical therapist in Boulder that when our first month of living here, we were on a hike and we ran into this guy, and I forget how this came about, but I think I was saying like, yeah, we just moved here, and you know how it is when you move somewhere new, you got to establish care with all your. I'm like, I don't have my guy anymore. Yeah, I don't have my acupuncturist. I don't have my
Totally.
like all. And he's like, oh my god, you got to go to Charlie Merrill, this physical therapist. He's amazing. So I ended up having a little thing and going to him. I was having a left lower back thing for over a year, just this dull ache in my left lower back. He does like all the structural tests on me. He's like, everything's strong, your core is strong. Like he's like, this is your brain. You're perceiving this pain. This is not anything actually wrong with your body. He's like, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to talk to your back and meditate and like open to this pain.
Yeah.
And I did, and it completely went away. And I had it for over a year every day.
Well, and the practice you described, I think, is a really interesting practice for any kind of pain, which is you can turn that experience or the sensation into the object of your meditation. So, usually if you're doing a breath-based meditation practice, you're focusing on the sensation of breath. But like one of the most powerful things I did with tinnitus was turn my tinnitus into the object of attention, which is really trippy because usually when we have an experience like that, we're trying not to pay attention to it. Yeah. And so again, what are we doing? Well, we're resisting it and we're like, I'm going to think about this and I'm going to think about that and I don't want to think about that.
But you're obsessing over it
when you meditate on it, it's really weird because now you're intentionally trying to think about it and then you'll lose attention. You'll start thinking about other things and you'll have to consciously bring your attention back to this thing that you hate. So it sounds like you did that with your back.
Yeah.
That's a meditation practice. I learned that actually because there was a monk who had really bad tinnitus, who was a Buddhist monk. And he said, the greatest object of meditation for me is simply the ringing in my ear. And that's all I pay attention to for like 8 hours a day. Can you imagine? But like,
that is why he's a monk.
That's why he's a monk. But it gets back to that same idea of when we're resisting something, we're creating more energy, we're creating more just sort of like mental suffering for ourselves. And that's the power of opening. And I will say this, there are certain experiences that I think in our ordinary state of consciousness, it's very difficult to open to. So it's great to meditate on something, but I've certainly had experiences. I think anybody who's had trauma may have certain qualities of the mind or experiences or emotions that are so intense, like that approach might not work. And that's where I think having a really good therapist, psychedelic assisted therapy, things like that, there are ways of going there. You can still open to it, but you might not be able to open to it in your ordinary consciousness. It's just like too intense, too painful.
Yeah, I really appreciated you giving insight into the book of your own narrative in your mind and how, kind of anxiously driven it was at times. And it comforted me a lot because I think we all want to know, like, we're not alone.
Yeah.
I'm like, I said, I'm like, oh my God, it's like Nate is in my head right now.
Yeah,
like,
totally.
With the fears that come through. And I know when you were contemplating doing psychedelic assisted therapy, we just had our last episode was on this with this amazing practitioner who has a company where they do these psychedelic assisted therapies with therapists on staff and whatnot. And, I expressed to him, I'm like, I'm probably just like many people. I'm so afraid to go crazy, lose my mind, not come back. Like I've had experiences with family members who've had really negative experiences. I've known so many trauma experiences with this. That it has closed me off so much. And like, of course, I'm going to be the one, right, that just like ruins my life because I go and try to do some like ketamine therapy or something.
Yeah.
So when you're sharing all those things that are going through your mind, I'm just like, oh, it's so refreshing and nice to like, I know that, none of us are alone with.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't talk about it much with people because this is just the narrative are of our own minds.
Yeah. I mean, well, I was in exactly the same boat. And I think had it not been for this book, I probably wouldn't have explored this. But I was interested in, do these compounds coupled with therapy allow us to cultivate more openness in the mind, particularly around those places that are really closed off. So for me, I had this one experience of flight anxiety, which is something I've had for like 20 years, where I started this session with my therapist, Sarah Lewis, who's here in Boulder, who's amazing. She's a professor in Europa. And I was like on this plane and flying around, and it was just like being on a plane, except for the last 20 years, being on a plane had felt really like anxiety inducing and uncomfortable. And in this experience, it was just like amazing. Like I wanted to live on airplanes. I was like, this is the greatest. I just I need to fly more, and then I watched myself like dying in a plane crash, and I was like, oh my God, it's so beautiful. Plane crashes are a work of art. It's like, God. And I know that sounds totally batshit
But
crazy.
you didn't have the emotion that you would typically have when you're seeing something like that. You had a different experience of emotion. It sounds like with the visualization you were having.
Exactly. Yeah. So what I came to find out is that when in these states, when we're doing psychedelic assisted therapy, particularly with ketamine, that was what I was studying, there's a way in which our normal association, so this ordinary process of what's called memory consolidation, where you have a memory, that memory gets attached to an emotion, and there's the feedback loop that happens. So, if you're scared of flying, you have a thought about flying, fear arises, you have more negative thoughts about flying, more fear, you're kind of in that loop.
Mm-hmm.
And what can happen with these compounds is it completely severs that tie. And now you're able to see even some of your most traumatic moments in your life with none of the emotional associations that have been attached to those moments. And so this is where they're doing all this research on MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, and the remission rates are crazy, like 67%. MAPS is doing that trial. It might be approved by the FDA soon. And so this is not for everybody. I try to say that in the book, be so careful. I think doing this on your own is almost definitely a mistake for most people.
Yes.
But if you have a really well-trained therapist, there's a possibility here that you can open the mind to those places that are so tender and so traumatic that there's, at least in my experience, very few other ways to really do that in ordinary life and ordinary consciousness.
Absolutely. But you can also practice opening on the plane too, right?
You can do that too.
So
exactly.
I did this, remember?
Yeah.
And I had a crazy fear of flying my whole life. I mean,
we're part of the same team.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Like diarrhea every time,
Yeah.
It's my whole system's just so messed up from just the my body being so tense of oh, here we go, and for me it was takeoff.
Yeah.
That's the part that I didn't like the most. And, knowing the statistics of X percentage of planes will always crash usually during takeoff within 15 minutes.
That's the key moment.
Right?
Those 2
That's
minutes.
the moment.
Yeah.
Those couple minutes where it's taking off, that's where you know if shit's going to hit the fan or not. And so I always had to do these things, right? I have to have my headphones in. I have to have noise canceling. I have to have Pearl Jam playing. I have to hold on to Mackie really tight and just squeeze my jaw and have this whole thing I would have to do in order to get through the experience. And then I was like, what if I just listen to the sounds that scare me?
Yeah.
Don't hold Mackie's hand. Just be in the moment fully.
Yeah.
I was really brave to do. This is I think psychedelics might be almost easier.
No, that is a psychedelic experience.
And
with or without drugs.
I did. And I was like, yep, these sounds are terrifying. But, and then reminding yourself of statistics, right? It's so safe to fly. It's worse to drive. All the things of just all right, I'm going to comfort myself with the knowledge of that I know that it really is safe.
Yeah.
I just need to have a different relationship to my fear and this scenario. And so I'm I'm not going to hold his hand. I'm just going to be with it. No, I'm not going to put the music on. Yeah. And I did it. And
I feel
fine.
so proud of you for doing that.
It's hard.
I've done that as well. And I know the courage it takes. And for people who don't have a fear of flying, there are other things, public speaking,
Yeah.
like everybody has their own, not everybody, but many people have their own flavor of this.
Yeah.
And to just do it and allow whatever happens to happen, like that is so courageous.
I think you
and
just
so
have to
bold.
thank you, have these experiences, and then it helps you have more of them too.
Yeah.
Like once I had the one, this really came from, I had this experience. I used to have obsessive compulsive disorder as a child. And when I was 16, I decided not to do the rituals anymore and be like, it's fine. Don't do it. You're going to wake up.
Yeah.
You'll be alive. Just stop.
Right.
So it was like knowing like that you can do these things. We
Yeah.
are really powerful, but you
Yeah.
have to go into the fear.
Yeah. And the discomfort is so intense.
It's so intense.
There's an interesting practice here too that I would just mention. Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
He was a Holocaust survivor and also a therapist. He had this really fascinating idea. He called it the practice of paradoxical intent. And the way he came up with this practice is he would have people come who were clients of his who would say like, oh my God, anytime I go to speak in public or go to a dinner party, I start sweating. And I'm trying not to sweat, but that makes me sweat more. And the same thing happens with all of these kinds of things. Like I go on a flight and I feel anxious and I try not to feel anxious, but if you try not to feel anxious, then you're more anxious. So he started saying to patients, okay, next time you're at a party, I want you to sweat as much as you possibly can. See if you can like wring out buckets full of sweat. And same with like something like flying. Like next time you go on a flight, see if you can just allow that anxiety to be as big as it's ever been in your whole
Hold on
life.
to the person next to you, the stranger, and shake in their arms.
Right. And there's actually something liberating about that. And he writes about how these people would basically overcome these really serious phobias. And again, like what's happening there is a kind of opening that it's like the magic of that practice is just being able to say like, you know what? I'm going to let this thing happen. I'm not going to fight against it. I'm not going to push against it. I'm not going to try to control it. And something magical happens when we do that.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild. It's crazy.
It's cool.
It's not easy.
It's not easy, but it is a cool technique that I know personally is working for me without going down the road of doing any kind of psychedelic therapy as of right now. I'm trying to see alternatives again, because I am still very closed to doing psychedelics.
And I think that like the only reason to do psychedelic assisted therapy is if you have like a full intuitive yes to it.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, I think it's like you should not be doing it. Like, yeah. So I tried to say that a million times in the book, and I hope it came through, just that this is one technique. There's so many others. If you look at the great mystics and saints and yogis and meditators, they didn't do ketamine assisted therapy. They didn't do MDMA. Like, they had other practices. And so
I appreciated you sharing that in the book, and also your self-consciousness around like maybe sounding like one of those, you're proselytizing. Like everybody is so into this right now, especially we live in Boulder. So
it's like you're missing out on like the most amazing experience available to humankind.
Yeah, like I have the keys to the knowledge of the universe and you don't, but you could.
Well, and that made me like not even want to go near the whole scene.
Yeah.
Because I was like, that is just gross. Like anybody who says that, no thanks.
Well, I think it's missing the point of a lot of things,
Yeah.
and I think that that's happening a lot with people is just, but at the end of the day, we're all just trying to find our place and feel good, right? And the feeling good thing, I think that keeps coming back to that. That's what people are really trying to do is they want to feel good. Totally. But by always wanting to feel good, we're closing ourselves off to really like more meaning in a sense.
Totally.
It seems like.
One other idea about feeling good that was really transformational for me. Have you read Dopamine Nation? Anna Lemke? Cool book. She's a psychiatrist at Stanford. She talks about this pleasure pain continuum. Basically, our brain is always trying to keep pleasure and pain in balance. And so when we overload the pleasure side, like we just say, I'm going to screen binge and I'm going to eat like crap and I'm going to drink a lot and do a bunch of drugs or whatever, we're overloading the pleasure centers of the brain, and the brain will balance that out by creating pain. So anybody who's ever had an addiction knows this, right? Like there's pleasure on the front end, but then there's tremendous pain on the back end. And that can lead to a cycle of addiction. What she said that was really interesting, though, is that we can work this pleasure pain balance the other way. If we actually like intentionally cultivate things that are uncomfortable or even painful. So think about like cold showers, ice baths, meditating, exercising, right? These are things that aren't often comfortable and they're somewhat painful, lifting weights, things like that. So we're experiencing pain now on the front end. The brain's going to try to balance that, and you're going to experience pleasure on the back end, and it's going to be a more lasting, more meaningful kind of pleasure. So to me, that was like a huge aha moment where I was like, oh, okay, that explains the game here.
Yeah.
Like if you want the real, lasting, enduring pleasure, then you can't go for the mind snacks and the easy pleasure hits. You might have to do something that's a little bit more uncomfortable.
Yeah, definitely.
We experienced a little bit of that this weekend with the wind blowing on the tent.
Right, totally.
So we, our friends who happened to be in town, they had an Airbnb with an extra bedroom. So after not sleeping, and just being tortured all night by this wind, the next night they said, hey, just stay with us. We have this extra room, no big deal. And there's been no bed that was as comfortable as that.
It wasn't
bed
anything
was. It was
special,
nothing
but we
special,
were
but
like,
right.
oh my God.
It's
walls?
quiet.
Walls? It's quiet and
Totally.
it's like this feeling of like just getting into that bed and being like,
Yeah.
wow.
Exactly.
It's
Whereas if you
incredible.
had been at the Four Seasons the night before, you'd be
Right.
like, what? This is a crap Airbnb. Like, it's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
There's something to this about, I know the comfort crisis, that Michael Easter book that we've talked about a lot on the podcast because Mackie's been reading it, to really putting yourself in extreme discomfort and how it allows you to see more pleasure in things.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes it's called like type 2 fun, right? We talk about that a lot when we're out on intense training runs and they're just, you're in the pain cave and you're just like, God, this is really intense and hard. And oh, the hail's coming. Okay, now we're stuck in a hailstorm for 20 minutes. Okay, we're wet and cold, but we still have to do 10 more miles of this. But we love it. We love it, right? We love it, And then when you get in that car and you've accomplished what you set out to do, there's something really satisfying in your brain that happens where you just feel so proud of yourself. You overcame, right? And it allows you to just feel that everything is great. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Wow, this potato chip right now, 5-star meal,
Totally.
right?
Totally.
Like this warm sweatshirt I'm putting on.
Yeah.
This is the most, amazing, Target sweatshirt that could exist.
Yeah. I think there's the distinction I would draw here is between pleasure and meaning. And the things that bring me the most meaning are things that were really hard. We actually have a motto in my family, which is we do hard things.
Yeah.
Love that.
And if I think about like getting married, so freaking hard. Having a kid, so freaking hard. Writing books, psychotic. Why would anybody do this? Right? Like you spend all this time writing this book and then people trash it on the internet and, it probably doesn't sell as much as you want. Like it's totally psychotic, but those are the things that bring us meaning. They're hard and they involve discomfort.
What could you share with the listeners that they could do to begin to open? And do you feel like we covered kind of open and this like, okay, I want to make sure like,
cool.
I know I know this feeling, of I'm starting to understand more of what this means, being more, in other words, could be expansive, I guess. Right. What are some tips for people who are feeling very closed and they would like to experience more of this opening?
Yeah. So I think let's start with spending less time in the closed state. So that to me starts with really looking at what are the ways in which you close down and how can you interrupt those habits. So for things like smartphone addiction, trying out a screen binge, trying out all the various screen fasting or screen restriction tactics, self-binding, which is a fancy word for like locking up your phone, kicking your phones out of your bedroom, designing your environment such that your phone isn't with you all the time, using do not disturb, using focus mode, leaving your phone at home. Those are all really powerful things to do at the outset.
Can I ask you, with your family, what do
Yeah.
you guys do with your phones? Do you have any kind of...
Yeah, so I have a 12-year-old daughter. So we talk a lot about phones right now. She doesn't have a phone yet. She has an Apple Watch. We have a screen family contract, which has our rules for phones. So phones are not allowed in the bedroom. Phones are not allowed at the dinner table. We actually do have one of these case safes where we'll lock up our phones occasionally. So we've tried to design a pretty clear architecture of practices around phones.
This just goes to show just how powerful the phone is.
Exactly.
Like, that the fact that
Yeah.
you're like, that we have to create this is like,
Yeah.
these things are like, take our attention so much. We think that we can just create a healthy relationship with them, but
Yeah.
our brains are really not designed like it. Like you were saying, the novelty of it, never knowing what
Yes.
you're going to get. You liken it to, imagine if you open your fridge and every time you opened it, there'd be like a different treat in there.
Exactly.
We would open our fridge constantly. We already do this, right? You come home
Yes.
and you open it, you're like, it's the same fucking eggs.
Yes.
There's no
But
snacks
if
in
your
here.
fridge were like the internet, it would have a new treat for you every single time you opened it. And you would probably open it all the time. And you'd probably be eating out of it all the time. So yeah, and I think particularly for like a 12-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old brain, I think we need to be even
Yeah.
more careful
Yeah.
because their brains haven't even come close to being fully developed. So I would start there. How am I closing? Second step would be to think about, what are the ways in which I can cultivate a little bit more openness? And before you even get to meditation, I think sometimes practices that allow you to relax your nervous system are a good first start. Because I think for a lot of people, we are so amped from digital stimulation, from the busyness of life, from all of it, that like meditating isn't even on the docket, right? Like you sit down and you're just all over the place. And I think many of us have forgotten even what it feels like to be in a more relaxed state. So things like yoga nidra, extended exhale breathing, yoga, I think are super powerful there. But then meditation we talked about, amazing tool. That's just a practice, it's like a daily practice in opening. And there's the formal side of it, which is sitting down to meditate, but then also what we talked about a little bit with that more informal practice, where if you look at your day, it's littered with all these idle moments. You're at the grocery store and you're standing in line, you're like stuck in traffic or whatever. And most of the time we reach for our phone in those idle moments. So what would happen if 25% of the time we took that time at the grocery store to just be like, wow, I'm going to see this Whole Foods in panoramic awareness and just like witness the chaos of it all.
This is so exciting to me.
It's really exciting.
I'm
I said
excited
25% of the time because I think it's too much to ask most people to be like, never check your phone again.
I
Yeah.
think,
You're
I
in a
think I've
traffic
gone
jam.
overboard with the phone at this point. I think I've kind of at the point where I'm
Yeah.
just like, this fucking thing has nothing to offer me anymore.
Right.
That
Yeah.
I'm just like, wow, something else that could be like interesting.
Yeah.
And like I could look at in Whole Foods. But remember when we were at the chocolate store, Peace, Love, and Chocolate, my favorite place on Pearl
Street. I love that place.
And I think I always go in there in the same sort of like fugue state where I'm just like, chocolate, like I want the dopamine hit. I want the piece of
Totally.
cake.
Yeah.
We're coming off of like going to dinner. I might have had a drink. So it's like
Nice.
this kind of like I'm
Yeah.
amplifying this like,
Right.
and I can see it like how
Yeah,
it's like
yeah, yeah.
amplifying my like dopamine hit is
Totally.
getting stronger.
Yeah.
I've never once noticed like the decor in that store.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I don't know, like the other time we were there, did I notice it or did you notice it? I forget.
I've always noticed it.
Yeah, but you've always noticed it. And I go, wow, there's like a total like cacao tree in here that they created. And he was like, you've never noticed that.
That's so
That's
fun.
3
You've never
years.
seen
So
that.
funny.
The years we've been
Yeah.
coming in here regularly. And I'm like, yeah, because I'm not here. I'm not ever here when I'm in this store. I'm
Right.
so focused on getting my hot chocolate or my piece
Yeah.
of cake
Totally.
that I'm not aware. So
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, this is an exciting journey we can all go on for those
It's
of us who are
totally
closed all the time.
Yeah, like Costco is amazing. I mean, I write about my day retreat in Costco, where I spent a long time in Costco. And that was the most exaggerated form of this, where I just started to see like, wow, they have this huge fan above the registers that's like 40 feet wide. That's crazy. I never saw that before. Like I didn't notice that Costco has pallets under every product in the store that alternate between red and blue. Like,
Wow.
who knew that?
That's crazy.
I didn't notice that. But it's kind of like, you know, you go to a museum and you look at the same painting for 3 hours and you don't really know that painting. You haven't really seen that painting until you've done something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's true of the rest of reality as well.
Yeah,
Like,
we're just taking in these little glimpses
yeah,
of things.
Walmart can be the painting, you know?
You can appreciate too how much goes into something like that. Like there is a lot that it took to build this out, to
Totally.
the organization of it all.
Yeah.
You know, all that it takes to get the pallets in the store and the people that have to make it all happen. It's like a whole thing.
Yeah. Well, or even just that, like, we have these places near our house where we can buy almost anything we need. And like, there's amazing food. There are avocados that come from Mexico and all over the world just so I can have guacamole. I mean, it's like, it's almost a practice in gratitude.
Sure.
And we know from the science on gratitude that that's one of the most efficient and powerful ways of cultivating a more optimal mind state.
Yeah.
Like just simply being like, we have avocados. That's amazing.
Yeah.
In Colorado, you can't grow an avocado here.
Right.
Or you could choose to focus on the negative and be like, they're not ripe and
Right,
I'm a bad
right.
person because I'm buying an
Yes.
avocado from Mexico.
Sure. Yeah. And whatever, the supply chain
Yeah.
is full of exploitation or whatever.
But that's a choice that
Yeah.
is an interesting one to observe in yourself too.
Yeah.
Like the negativity bias that some of us carry, to also
For
feel virtuous, to feel like we're somehow better because we're
Yeah.
even having that thought, and
Yeah.
we're more conscious, right?
Yes.
That's one I notice a lot with people.
Yeah.
Myself included, from time to time, like and then kind of checking in with myself to be like, are you trying to feel powerful in this moment in some way,
Yeah.
right? Versus it's just hard to exist in a lot of ways. It's hard
Totally.
to navigate this human experience and everything that we're being shown and told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really important point that all of these tools of consciousness can be weaponized.
Mm.
And some of the scariest interpersonal situations I've been in have been with people who were acting in really problematic ways under the guise of consciousness. It's actually much less scary for me when somebody's just totally unconscious and, you know, raging than when somebody's using like a consciousness tool as sort of like the facade over what's really just like really hardcore rage or anger.
Well, that seems to happen a lot in, you know, with like the kind of gurus and things.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
think about all these like yogi cults
Yeah,
that have
the
happened
Bikram
where,
stuff.
all
Yeah.
sorts of sex scandals and people stealing money. And
Yeah, it is really
it's
interesting.
pretty
And
weird.
people kind of latching on because they want the handbook. Who doesn't want the handbook of like
Totally.
how to navigate life and be a good
Yeah.
person? And also, again, going back to feeling more bliss, right? And then somebody comes along and says, I have the answers to that. And if you follow this thing and I can teach you how to be more conscious, but then that person is, you know, stealing and having sex with people in the group. And it's like, what's going on here?
Totally.
Not that it happens in
Yeah.
all these scenarios, but it does happen quite a
Yeah.
bit.
It does.
We have a guest on recently. We're gonna have to have a part 2 because he worked for a lot of these different quote unquote big like consciousness guru leader types.
Yeah.
And he has quite some stories without naming names, but just like the behind the scenes of what that's
Totally.
like, you know,
Yeah.
being in those, what would you call them? They're not like multi-level marketing. They're like consciousness, like, I don't know,
Sure.
like a landmark. Not that it's landmark, but you know,
Yeah.
you know, what's that called? That kind of group,
No.
those groups. But there's many
Sure.
of them. You know, Tony
Yeah.
Robbins is
Sure.
another one.
Yeah.
And they can have pros, you know, just as
Yeah.
much as they can have cons. But it's like it's kind of hard to navigate some of this stuff of like where do we go to be more to become more conscious and to, you know, but so to finish this out, you're talking about meditation and different ways to meditate, and I can also imagine walking's in there, kind of walking meditation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That one I feel like is healthy
Yeah.
for us all in a lot of different ways.
And even just walking without the earbuds and the podcast.
Yeah.
And
That's the hard thing for me.
not that there's anything wrong with that. I do that sometimes too, but like I really actually have been trying to be intentional about when I walk, it's just me and nature. And that
Yeah.
in itself is a kind of meditation. The
Mhm.
mind gets to just like spin out. One of my favorite ones lately, I did this actually right before I came here because I had a hectic morning and I didn't want to bring that energy in here. I'll just lie down. It's kind of like yoga nidra or like a shavasana,
Mhm.
but I'll just lie down for like 20 or 30 minutes, put on like psychedelic music. So I call it in the book non-drug psychedelic experience.
Hmm.
And it's basically lying down, the blinders on, the music on, and just allowing my mind to go where it goes and allowing my
Cool.
body to experience relaxation.
Yeah.
It's psychedelic in the sense that music is the non-specific amplifier instead of the drug.
Mhm.
It's not, you're not going to have like some crazy trip, but I find it to be just a really restorative practice. And that afterwards, I just feel more open and relaxed. And I'm literally not doing anything.
Yeah, you're just laying there.
There's no technique.
Yeah.
I try
Cool.
not to have a technique.
Yeah, it's great.
If there is a technique, it's trying not to try.
Right.
That
I
makes
think that's
sense.
really
Right.
cool.
And I'll notice myself trying to then be like, oh, I'm going to control my exhale and like try to relax a little bit, or I'm going to pay attention to the sensations of breath. And in this particular practice, my reminder will be like, oh, that's okay. I can just lie here. I can just do nothing.
Yeah, do
So
nothing.
that in itself
Love that.
is a powerful practice.
I'm going to try that.
Doing nothing
Yeah.
isn't nothing. That's
Giving yourself
that's the thing.
Doing nothing is like the most amazing thing in
Yeah.
our world, where we're always trying to do something and we're shaming ourselves if we waste half an hour, whatever that means.
Yeah, I think one of my yoga instructors was like, the most productive thing we can do is to do nothing. That is productive.
Totally.
And I was like, oh wow, that's great. What a relief.
Totally.
You know?
Totally. Yeah, and there is totally a productivity argument that like after that 30 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you're going to be so much more productive. And you're probably going to have that breakthrough idea that you've been searching
Well, that's
for.
the trap, right? That's part of the trap.
Yeah. But that breakthrough idea is not going to come an hour into trying to get to inbox zero. Like
Right.
your mind is just so hyper focused and fatigued at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other tips before we wrap up
Other tips
that you found really impactful?
I would just say, we talked about meditation. There's this whole idea of letting go that I think is really powerful, which we've touched on a little bit. But to me, in some ways, the essence of opening is just getting to a point where you can almost like ask for help and let go of the effort, especially around those things we were talking about, tinnitus, chronic pain, the things that just, they're not going anywhere. That this is where it gets to be more of a spiritual practice, I guess. But for me, having just some connection to something other than myself, where I would say, God, I need your help right now. Or just like, help me accept what's happening and let go. In some ways, this is I dedicated the book to my grandma, and this is a practice that came directly from her. Just, very different context. She grew up in rural North Carolina during the Depression, hardcore Christian, so different spiritual framework, the whole thing. But at the base of everything she was doing was this kind of like radical practice in letting go. And I think that's what's so cool about opening, but also so scary about opening, is that we are kind of entering terrain where we're no longer running the show. And having some sort of spiritual practice like that makes it explicit that like, I am not the master of this particular play that's happening anymore, and I need a little bit of help here. Because when you get on that plane and you take off the headphones and your eyes open during takeoff and you have a background like you described, I mean, that is the ultimate act of letting go and trust, and just like, yeah. So, and I try to be very careful about like, I don't even think it's right to call that a practice, because like, what are you really practicing there? You're not practicing anything. You're opening up a space for something else to happen. But I think, we've all had moments like that. And for me, those are the most interesting moments in my whole life. Terrifying, scary, edgy, all that. But like those moments are really, really amazing.
I think it's really coming into connection with this ultimate truth, which is that, like you said, we don't run the show.
Yeah.
The show must go on. The show is going on with or without us. It's happening. This universe, this world. And we are just this little microcosm of this big thing that's occurring. And the more we try to impose our wants and wishes and desires and control onto it, the harder it can be to actually flow with life and experience what we are often looking for, which is a more blissful experience in life.
Yeah.
I think we close off to that.
Well, and I appreciate the two of you for doing work in longevity that also recognizes that insight, because I feel like so much of the discourse in this longevity field is about the opposite. It's about like, we are going to harness nature and impose our will upon it such that we all live to 180, when the reality is like, we're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen. And we might get hit by a bus tomorrow, even like doing all the right longevity practices. So, and to your point, we were talking about this before we started rolling, but just like, I appreciate that you're creating a space where we can talk about longevity, both as like, how do we live longer and increase health span, but also like, how do we enhance the moments that we have while we're here? Because it might not be that long.
Yeah. It's like, okay, if you live to be 100, but did you spend most of those years really like hyper focused on how to get to that?
Living to 100?
How to get to that 100th
So then you have a really great 99th year.
But your whole day
but
is
you're like living in an assisted living facility at that point. And
It's focused on my Garmin body battery.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. There was a word for it. You and our friend were talking about. What's it called? The person who's into that. They're like
the quantified self.
Quantified self. Yeah. Sure. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if I didn't have to have this Garmin, I hate this thing. I hate the numbers. I hate it telling me if I'm doing, quote unquote, good or bad on the run or whatever.
Right.
It's just like, I just want to run.
Yeah.
I just want to, like, I know if I'm working hard or if I'm working easy.
Totally.
But I understand that these things can be really helpful for performance. And
sure.
I have opened to this. He'll tell you, I was very close to this watch. I was like, I don't want one of those.
Yeah.
In a way, right? But I think this is such an incredible conversation. And I hope that everybody gets a copy of Open, Living with an Expansive Mind, a Distracted World. We got ours at Barnes & Noble. I know you can find it in bookstores everywhere, and Amazon, I'm assuming.
Amazon, wherever you can find books.
Yeah, and we'll link to the book and everything in the show notes, and where to connect with you on your Instagram and your website. Perfect. All of that will be in the show notes for the guests. And do you have anything like coming up in particular that you want to share with anybody? Any events or anything like that?
No, I would just say that we do have a newsletter my wife and I write once every couple weeks with tips on relationships and mindfulness, things like that. So that's free. And
I might have to have you back on to talk about, if you're still talking about your book, the 80-80
we
marriage.
We're always talking about our book on marriage.
Yeah, because I would love, that would be a fun.
And there's a new one in the works. That's
nice.
going to be the next book. Cool. It'll be a few years, but
that's amazing. Yeah, that's really, really cool. Relationship stuff is always fun to talk about.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, our cat made it through the podcast, everybody, without snoring.
Yeah.
I don't know if Mackie's been able to edit that out. But
usually you can't hear it, so it's just distracting to us.
Just so you know, we've had to open to the loudest snoring possible.
Right, during a podcast. That's kind of intense.
Yeah. But wonderful. Yeah. Thank you guys, everyone, for listening. And just a reminder that you can find all of our episodes on YouTube as well. So if you are watching YouTube right now and watching this, hi. But if you're listening to this, you can go over and watch it and see our amazing guests in person, and you might see the cat snoring. So
pretty exciting.
And if you could review the podcast, that would be wonderful on either Spotify or Apple, and rate it as well. Anything else, Mackie?
That's it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks so much.